Ladies and gentlemen, first let me welcome you to the Royal Society. My name is Paul Nurse. I'm President of the Royal Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here, particularly those who may be visiting us for the first time. In particular, I'd like to welcome Lord Fellows, who is representing the Queen here this evening, and also the many members of the Huxley family who I know are with us this evening as well. I'm going to say a few words, but before I do that, I'd like to thank particularly Bob Simmons and David Trenton, who have been very closely involved in both the organising the evening and helping disseminate information about it. Now, just occasionally, but it has to be said very rarely, we have the privilege to know a giant of science. And tonight, we are celebrating the life of such a giant of science, Andrew Huxley. Now, most of us scientists are pleased to make one major discovery in their lives, but Andrew Huxley has made at least two, and in my view more, but he's particularly known for his work on nerve action potentials and, of course, on muscle contraction. His Nobel Prize, shared in 1963 with Alan Hodgkin and John Eccles, recognised the importance and characterisation of nerve action, and his Royal Society Copley Medal, incidentally the oldest medal in science, recognised both that and also muscle contraction. He's had very close associations with the Royal Society over his long career. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society at 37, a very young age for those on the biological side. He was a Royal Society Research Professor. He gave the Royal Society Croonian, Florey and Blackett lectures. And he, of course, served as President during 1980 to 1985. Exactly, it has to be said, 100 years after his grandfather, Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. During his presidency, and he had major impact, there are two things I'd like to remind us all of. He launched the scheme of University Research Fellows, now one of our great initiatives, numbering 300 of our younger scientists, our early career scientists, mostly in their 30s, who will be the backbone and future leaders of British science. He also started, whilst at the Royal Society, systematic public engagement. And it was during his presidency that the public understanding of science, stimulated by the Bodmer Report, was properly put in place and has set the future for the Royal Society in an area that we now take extremely seriously and is very important for what we do in our science and our science outreach activities. So Andrew Huxley was a great scientist. He was a great researcher, and he was also a great scientific leader. And we will celebrate his achievements tonight, with 6 short talks on different aspects of his extraordinarily varied life. I'm going to run through the 6 speakers who will be speaking because I don't want to be hopping up and down in between each speaker, so I'm going to ask them to come up after each one finishes. We're going to begin with Sir John Bradfield, Senior Bursar at Trinity College during Andrew's term as Master, and who founded the Cambridge Science Park. He'll talk about Andrew and Trinity College. Then we'll have Professor Roger Woolwich, Emeritus Professor of Experimental Physiology at UCL, who will talk about Andrew and UCL. Then we have Professor Jonathan Ashmore, Professor of Biophysics at UCL, and currently President of the Physiological Society. And I should say we need to thank the Physiological Society and the British Biophysical Society for their help also in organising this event. He also, this is now back to Jonathan, chairs the committee overseeing the Royal Society's work on the history of science, an important element of what we do, not always fully appreciated. We have a major cultural activity here on the history of science. And he will talk about Andrew and the Physiological Society. Then we have Professor Dennis Noble, Emeritus Professor of Cardiovascular Physiology at Oxford, and his talk is called From the Hodgkin-Huxley Axon to the Heart. Then Professor Malcolm Irving, Professor of Biophysics at King's College London, who will talk about Andrew's work on muscle. And finally, we end with Stuart Huxley, who's Director of Huxley Bectram Engineering Limited, based at Cottenham, Cambridge, who will be talking on Andrew Huxley, the engineer, because in addition to being a great biologist, I think as most of us know in this room, he applied physics to biology and recognized completely the importance of getting the right technology to answer important scientific questions. And he, in that sense, was a true multidisciplinary researcher, which of course is today all the vogue, and he was there in the 1950s. So if we could start with Sir John, please, and then I'll ask each speaker to follow one after another, and then I will come up at the end of the six talks. Please.
Good evening, everybody. You'll have to forgive my reading a bit, because one of my eyes picked up a foreign body on the train, and the other one seems to be sympathizing with it a bit. It's a very great but sad honour to speak of Andrew in relation to Trinity, or indeed in relation to anything else. And I'll just run through a few of his early achievements and features and details. He was born in 1917, not much of a year to be born in, and entered the college in 1935 when the master was J.J. Thomson, so he may have been infected a bit by J.J. His tutor was the much-loved Patrick Duff, later professor of Roman law. Tutors chose their own pupils and acted as their general guide and guardian, and specialists, of course, gave the small-class college teaching in the pupil subjects in parallel with the big university lectures for all colleges. Patrick was a really traditional English gentleman and the Mr. Chips of Trinity. He very much knew a first-class pupil when he saw one, and he scored many times over with Andrew. Andrew also became a very great friend of a distant relative, G.M. Trevelyan, who later became Master of Trinity, a very distinguished historian, and I had the privilege of being admitted Junior Research Fellow by him precisely 65 years ago this month. It makes me feel quite old. Andrew was an entrance scholar, studied natural sciences, specialized in physiology, won a first, as you might expect, in each of his 3 undergraduate years, became a senior scholar 37, began research in 38, won a Michael Foster studentship in 39, which was highly appropriate because Michael Foster and the Huxleys very much interwoven in their careers. I've been looking into it, most extraordinary, and very much concerned with UCL. Then he had the very well-deserved 1941 reward of a junior research fellowship at Trinity. World War II, unfortunately, deflected him, as so many other people, into operational research with anti-aircraft command and then the Admiralty, and he returned to Trinity in 1946, plunged into research, but gained some experience elsewhere by supervising, demonstrating, and giving a few lectures. His research progressed so well that in 1949, just 3 years later, he was elected to the small special class of Trinity's senior research fellows, nicknamed the Bertrand Russell Group. In 1951, he became a senior research officer in the university, and just to ensure that he had absolutely no spare time, he became a much valued Trinity Director of Studies in Physiology, and for 4 terms, very unselfishly took the arduous job of Secretary of the College Council in order to relieve the aging senior bursar, geologist Tress Nicholas, who later became the first fellow of any Cambridge or Oxford college to reach the age of 100 in good shape. Shows how well we feed them at Trinity. Further distinguished research, of course, followed for Andrew, significant parts of it with his great Trinity mentor, Alan Hodgkin, such a wonderful man. Honours showered upon them. Each had 4 tightly packed inches in Who's Who. Today, of course, electrophysiologists seeking money for advanced research look nervously around at the mountains of molecular biology and developmental biology around them, but at least Alan and Andrew can rest secure in the physiologist's Valhalla, knowing that they achieved unrivaled heights in their own particular mountain. In 1960, on A.V. Hill's advice, I believe, Andrew took a major UCL chair, followed by a Royal Society chair there, and we shall hear all about this and all his other scientific work from outstanding experts later, and I'm looking forward to that very much. Then in 1984, he returned to his alma mater as Master of Trinity. Here, I can't do better than quote from the splendid speech of another distinguished Trinity physiologist, Professor Ian Glynn, then Vice Master, at the installation dinner held in Andrew's honour. Ian spoke thus, with very minor amendment to fit this occasion. When God created the world, he arranged that the Council of the Royal Society would meet on Thursdays and the Council of Trinity College would meet on Fridays. That is why we are able to welcome you as Master of Henry VIII's College while you are still President of the club, the Royal Society, founded by Henry's great-great-great-great nephew, Charles II. And we are very glad to welcome back to Trinity someone who was sufficiently attached to the college to be Secretary of the Council during what must have been one of the busiest periods in a busy scientific life, and who has been sufficiently attached to Cambridge to continue to live there while working in London. But there are, of course, other reasons for welcoming you. To be at the same time a member of the Order of Merit and a Nobel laureate and the President of the Royal Society may not be unprecedented for Masters of Trinity, but neither is it so common as to leave us unimpressed. And Ian went on to reflect that having Andrew's long-lived mother abiding in the Master's Lodge in 1984 with them would be a remarkable living link with the past, because she was the daughter-in-law of Thomas Henry Huxley, aforementioned, the great supporter of Charles Darwin, whose Origin of Species was published in 1859, 125 years earlier. Extraordinarily long link there. Well, as Andrew used to say rather often at the beginning of a sentence, that was a marvellous evening. But Andrew was soon immersed in the hurly-burly of the 14-member College Council and college meetings open to all fellows and a multiplicity of other business. There was in his very first term a most unusual and important but difficult college meeting, where it fell to me to propose that Trinity should support a parliamentary bill providing that the very small port of Felixstowe should expand significantly upriver toward Ipswich onto adjacent Trinity farmland. Uniquely, we'd rather foolishly arranged a coach visit to the site for fellows who wished to go there. And as a result, the meeting was very fierce and long. There was much voting on complex amendments and so on, because everyone thought they knew all about it. But Andrew proved an absolutely superb chairman. We knew we had a brilliant scientist. We didn't know we had a brilliant chairman, but he was firm but fair. And after a long debate, a motion supporting the bill was passed with 48 in favour, none against, and 2 abstentions. This was significant for the port, for Trinity, and indeed for Britain, because it was the first port's really big extension. Trinity 1, it was called, and the 2 others followed, Trinity 2 and Trinity 3. They were such as to make it the leading container port in Britain, and make sure that big container ships called here to drop our containers on us rather than dropping them at Rotterdam or Antwerp and costing us the job of transshipping them. The meeting was very protracted, as I said, but Andrew proved himself really excellent, and after a long debate, the motion was passed 48 in favour, none against, and 2 abstentions. We then tried to make it all a bit green by having a very good nature reserve that I was proud of, and a rather beautiful fishing lake where surprisingly, there's been a great outburst of orchids on the bank of this lake, and there's been a great outburst of orchids at the Cambridge Science Park too. Most extraordinary. I have no idea why. I'm sure Andrew and Alan, in their different ways, because Alan was very much a naturalist, would have been fascinated by them, because they were always great supporters of Felixstowe and the Science Park. Soon after the difficult Felixstowe meeting, there was a highly complex meeting to consider a large college residential scheme on the site of the Blue Boar Hotel in Trinity Street, which will be known to all the Cambridge people here and probably to many others. It was the largest scheme that the college had attempted since the 1850s, when the great Whewell had Hill's Courts built for us. Andrew again performed absolutely admirably, chairing firmly and fairly and clearly a lengthy architectural discussion which otherwise would have got hopelessly confused and gone on till now, very likely. And eventually a unanimous vote was given for the go-ahead on roughly the lines proposed. Next, a difficult meeting about monitoring our admissions system, an area where many fellows had long experience and strong views. Many attended, long debate, decision to adjourn for a month, which was very clever chairing by Andrew. And at the adjourned meeting, the existing system was continued for a couple of years, and by a strong vote of 97 to 5, full marks to Andrew for obtaining that degree of unanimity. And for the record, the system is little changed today and works pretty well, because I'm glad to say that Trinity currently comes top of the monitoring university exam tables. So Andrew had a real baptism of fire in the first 3 college meetings that he handled. They were all major, all profoundly different, and all satisfactorily concluded. And I think his admirable outcome was due to Andrew's high regard for 3 qualities: devotion to Trinity, a careful attitude to the duties of the master, and scrupulous attention to detail, which perhaps was his chief feature. Devotion, duty, detail. His devotion to the college shines out from this short extract from the speech he made at the Dinner-in Hall celebrating his installation as master. He said, "It is impossible for me to express the depth of my feelings on finding myself master of this magnificent college. I've had an intense attachment to Trinity ever since I came here, almost exactly 50 years ago, to take the entrance scholarship exam. I am at all times conscious of what I owe, not only to those who gave me formal instruction, but also, perhaps even more, to my contemporaries, and perhaps most of all, to those who are just a little older than myself, senior undergraduates, research students, and young fellows, and, of course, chief among them, my great friend Alan Hodgkin, who was master before me, who later introduced me to research and with whom I worked for several years on the excitation processes in nerve. That epitomized his devotion to Trinity. His duty as master flowed direct from the declaration in the statutes, still ringing in the ears of Trinity Fellows from Greg Winter's splendid installation about 2 weeks ago. And it runs, I, XYZ, appointed master of Trinity College, do hereby promise that I will faithfully perform the duties of my office without fear or favour, will observe the statute, ordinances and good customs of the college, and will in all things endeavour to promote its welfare. Andrew very carefully complied, performing duties firmly, that is, without fear, and fairly, without favour. And whomever he was dealing with, his attitude was the same. He was the personification of firm and fair in a very courteous way, as you all know. And that epitomized his attitude to duty as master. The third quality facilitating good mastership was his attention to detail, which was unparalleled. This was not in the statutes, it was a special Andrew quality. He felt that to do a good job, it was essential to get his mind round the relevant detail thoroughly, and not only at complex college and council meetings, but also in the rarefied atmosphere of the wine committee, where he very shrewdly avoided getting bogged down in the quagmire of arguments about recherche vintages, but attend great attention to the number of bottles that had been used. which he could quantify. And this valuable third quality, attention to detail, was not found in all masters, I may say. Lord Adrian was splendid in a dozen ways and on the ball at Trinity, except when he occasionally misunderstood intentionally. It was a very clever technique he had. But when Vice-Chancellor, he would sometimes come to a Council of the Senate meeting with a big envelope of papers unopened under his arm, sit down in the chairman's seat, open the envelope, saying, "Now, let's see what we've got today." I have this on complete, undisputable authority, but not an ideal approach to detail. He was probably wishing, of course, that he was in his lab in one of his favourite occupations, which was rubbing conducting jelly on his head prior to displaying his brainwaves to the class, as he did, I can vouch for, in the superb lectures of his that I went to in Part 1 Physiology. Rab Butler dodged detail in a different way. During our modest student troubles around 1970, he presided over college council meetings with a group representing the junior members, and after diplomatic political opening about the pros and cons of leaving the gates open all night or getting rid of South African investments, and listening to the discussion for a little while, he would almost always fall asleep. The students were very perplexed, the council was very embarrassed, and it was very difficult for me as senior bursar trying to keep the minutes and hold our negotiating position. Added to which, Reb sometimes woke up and made cogent remarks showing he'd heard the whole debate. It was probably a clever technique of his, like Adrian's misunderstanding. Well, Andrew would never, never, never have drifted into such situations. His special attention to detail would have prevented it utterly. In any case, life was not all council meetings and college meetings. In February 85, he became Master of Member in 84. The Prince of Wales, who was an undergraduate member and later honorary fellow, was entertained extensively in the lodge. In June that year, the Premier of China lunched there with several of his staff and visited the science park after lunch. Later that month, the Duke of Edinburgh, Chancellor of the University and an honorary fellow, was the guest of honour at a very large gathering in the lodge, doubtless arranged by Andrew's wife, whom I'll refer to later. Then, after Andrew's retirement as Master, 30 June 90, the Duke attended a very cordial farewell lunch in the lodge, and there were farewell gatherings for fellows and for non-academic staff, and lots of presentations and so on. Andrew was much liked and valued at Trinity, and on reaching the initial retiring age of 70, he had been prolonged by an overwhelming vote. We've been very lucky with our masters for a long time. And in conclusion, I'd like to comment just very briefly on a few less well-known aspects of Andrew's life at Trinity. First of all, his great enthusiasm for shooting game birds. This puzzled me greatly in such a peaceful person, but I gather he was brought up to it by family members and by long friendship with G.M. Trevelyan, and he very often went up to Northumberland to shoot on GMT's estates. I dislike killing birds unless they're a nuisance or needed for food. On the other hand, I have no compunction at all about fish, which are 3 classes lower in zoological classification. And in my youth, I loved nothing better than spinning for pike, which is really exciting. Of course, you're doing something all the time, and they're such vicious brutes, they deserve to be caught anyhow. Then there was the red car. Andrew had quite a nasty car accident. But immediately he went out and bought a bright red car, thinking it would be more visible to other drivers. I remember being amazed at seeing him in the scarlet vehicle, looking rather like a brash undergraduate, showing off. But when I recognized who it was and heard the reason, I admired both logic and speed of action, which was typical of him. And when Andrew could no longer drive, we were very grateful indeed to his daughter Janet and others who brought him into lunch at Trinity so that we could go on enjoying his company. Perhaps most interesting is the question, the fundamental question, whether Andrew should really have been a physiologist at all. He told me that he came up to Trinity expecting to become a physicist, but was swept off his feet into physiology by the Hodgkin brilliance and charm. Though Andrew clearly still had strong leanings toward physics and indeed engineering, and I reckon that if the engineering genes which have surfaced so clearly and brilliantly in Stuart had been released somehow in Andrew, all the way into engineering, he might well have been first with the jet engine, or if living years ago, he might well have invented the steam engine. Such was the immensely powerful mind that he possessed, especially about how things worked, whether they were muscle or engines. Well, I could go on with tidbits of that kind, but time doesn't permit. Finally, however, I must mention Andrew's secret weapon, which was his wife, Richenda Pease. She had read natural sciences at Newnham, and her highly sociable and highly socialist mother gave Sunday lunches for big gatherings of students and others. Andrew was deeply devoted to Richenda. I was greatly touched by the affectionate remarks in his installation speech, a bit of which I've quoted already, saying he did that she was that evening wearing her wedding dress, the dress that she'd worn in the same hall for their wedding reception 37 years earlier, and that wearing it at the installation was to mark the start of a fresh phase of their lives together. You might well have thought that such a dress would have been long since discarded as a bourgeois bagatelle. Not so. It was treasured. Richenda fully inherited her mother's sociability and could brilliantly handle guests of any age, race or creed or interest. She was infinitely kind to fellows' wives, particularly the disabled ones. She was infinitely good with college non-academic staff, e.g. in entertaining them and chatting with them in the big town centre Trinity Sainsbury, which I created in order to use up profitably a large area of hinterland there and anchor the value of our adjoining shops. I little thought that it might be a perfect place for Richenda to engage in good Trinity staff relations, but it was, and she did. She sadly died in 2003. All this unquestionably contributed to Andrew's high standing with our large body of fellows, non-academic staff and spouses. They generally viewed the couple as ideal inhabitants of the lodge who combined the outstanding academic reputation and courteous goodness of the master with the warm kindness and sociability of his wife. And I venture to hope that as the years roll by, Andrew's reign in Trinity will continue to be remembered by all of us in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely. Duty, devotion, detail. We could use that as a theme. And we shall, in a way, you see. Let's start at UCL. In 1960, the Department of Physiology at UCL was a very confident institution. It had been founded in 1836 as the first such institution. I'm sorry, I have to keep here, but now I'm behind this, I can't see it. Never mind. As it was founded as the first Department of Physiology in the country in 1836, and in 1960 still thought of itself as the best. It was housed in this rather splendid building, which had been put up for the purpose by Ernest Starling at the turn of the century. Very nice modernist lettering there. It has huge windows because it's a kind of factory of learning. It's a mill building. You used to have shafts in it in order to instruct the students better. And the light floods into these big classrooms to illuminate the microscopes and to throw light on the experimental physiology, which was seen as central to education. The idea of education in physiology at UCL was firmly rooted in medical education and the importance of understanding the physiological systems of the body, circulation, respiration, and so on, in animals, where animals mostly meant mammals. It was also the home of a few very distinguished, quite a number really, of distinguished scientists who were working on isolated tissues. And among these, we've had A.V. Hill, who's already been referred to, Bernard Katz and J.Z. Young in related departments. So in the head of this department at the time was this man, Sir George Lyndall Brown, at that time known as G.L. Brown, later the long-serving secretary of the Medical Research Council. But at this time, in 1960, he had finished an 11-year period as head of department, and he'd brought it into rude health and lively spirits. So it was very self-confident. Now, GL was appointed to the Waynflete Chair of Physiology at Oxford in 1960, and so there was a vacancy. How are we going to fill this vacancy? I know nothing of what might have been discussed at that time. I was a lowly research student, of course. But I'm sure that A.V. Hill had some say in the matter. And we know that Andrew says that he was virtually offered the position, which suggests something less than a great competition. And we know that A.V. Hill was probably behind this, because we know for sure that A.V. wrote to Andrew Huxley, recommending him to accept. We know that because Andrew himself often told the story. And in that letter, A.V. quoted advice that he himself had received from Lord Rutherford 40 years earlier. And this advice, in short, is, for God's sake, get out. So maybe stirred by this call to arms, Andrew did, in a way, get out and came to UC. But this is what get out might mean. I'm quoting now from an interview which Andrew gave to Alan Macfarlane in 1970, which is on the website. He says, "My habit was to go to London early on Monday morning, stay Monday and Tuesday nights, home for Wednesday night, back to London Thursday morning, home late Friday for the weekend. I did not have a flat in London, but used bed and breakfast places close to University College. So stayed working until nearly midnight and was back at work before 9 the following morning. Devotion, duty. So probably I spent more hours in the department than anybody else." That's probably right. I think he did. Now, that sounds rather a tough schedule to me, more suitable to a temporary assignment than a long-term commitment. But Andrew served 9 years as head of department, which in modern times, it's not very good for the 19th century, but in the modern times that's seen as a fair stint in quite an onerous job. But not content with that, he then remained at University College for a further 15 years as Royal Society professor. Evidently, Andrew found University College congenial. He had found an academic home and he stayed with it until his conventional retirement age of 65. So how did University College find Andrew? Andrew found a congenial home. What did University College find in Andrew? Let's look at the department at that time. Here is the composition of the department. You probably can't read those names, but it's not of importance really. I'll refer to a few of them. There's one other professor of physiology. We'll say a little about him. A dozen academic staff. Does this thing work? Yes. A dozen academic staff labelled here. A similar number of research staff over on this side. Let's say a little about Professor John Gray. Later Sir John Gray and long-serving secretary of the Medical Research Council. So John Gray at that time was very concerned with science education in University College and was interested in using the BSc and MSc degrees in the department to attract into physiological sciences people from different disciplines, not just concentrating, as had been the case, on people entering through the medical route. And that flow increased greatly during the 1960s. I don't know to what extent Andrew was complicit in increasing the flow. I know he was very involved with individual students. Whether he was involved in the administrative side, I do not know. But it was very successful. And if I look along the front row here, I see Jonathan Ashmore and Malcolm Irving, who both entered through the MSc degree within those years. I see Dennis Noble, who entered through the medical route. And I'm sure I don't have to look too far back there to see people who entered through the BSc route too. So a lot of distinguished physiologists were in fact recruited through these routes. Now, this department I'm sorry, I'm moving on too fast. But you get a flavour here. This department was rather cohesive. G.L. Brown had made it so. He encouraged a kind of family atmosphere which existed. And it was complete with a court jester. And the court jester was Jim Pascoe, J.E. Pascoe. Typically, his name springs into prominence from this innocent-looking typographical layout, but somehow his name is the most prominent. Jim Pascoe died last year, sadly, but he's remembered here particularly and will represent the common man in the next few remarks that I make. So this little tribe has its own rituals, and Andrew was thrown into these rituals. Here you see one of them. Andrew approaching this with characteristic determination. Actually enjoyment. I'm sure he was having a great time at this game of tennis. Lynn Beinman serving on the left. Here, I'm not sure if he's having such a good time, but he's clearly playing a central coordinating role. And then there's the Yard of Ale. I lack a picture of the notorious Yard of Ale competition, and so for that reason the story will remain untold. There are no prizes for guessing the winner. So now a bit more about Andrew in the department. Sorry, I lost my way a bit. Yes, the next point I need to make is really made by these slides, and that is that Andrew joined in all of the department's activities. He was a participator, and he was in the department long hours. We've already mentioned that. He was present at the departmental tea and the departmental coffee, not every day, but most days. And he could be approached on these occasions, and he would be quite friendly and engage in conversation. It was better, though, to avoid small talk. And the reason for that was that Andrew simply knew too much about everything. And any topic that you raised would be taken completely seriously. Jim Pascoe said on one occasion, "It always rains on Wednesday afternoons." Wednesday afternoons is Student Sports Day. To which Andrew replied, "Are you sure?" And it's as though Jim really should have the evidence to hand. In fact, one rather supposed that Andrew knew of some statistical breakdown of rainfall by day of the week, to which he would shortly refer. Andrew, of course, did have a good sense of humour and was aware of this peculiarity of his own, and so it could be turned against him. We could play this game the other way around. On one occasion, Andrew had a rather flamboyant female visitor who spent some time in his office, and after she had left, he came out of the office and said, "She assailed me with all the senses." And Jim said, "What? Touch?" To which Andrew had to reply, sadly, "No, nor taste." The Friday lunchtime seminars usually saw Andrew in the front row preparing to ambush the speaker. And we've already heard about an ambush technique. The one attributed to Andrew, and the ambush technique is to fall asleep during the presentation, nod off. The uninitiated would suppose that he was asleep, but he wasn't asleep, he was thinking. And so when he was apparently roused by the polite applause at the end of the speaker's presentation, he would ask a devastating question. Sometimes just a penetrating question, but often enough a devastating question. He wasn't aiming to discomfort the ambushee. That's not the point. The point was to raise the tone of the debate, to get a truly interesting debate going. And in that he often succeeded. And he succeeded because his known habits in this way meant that people took pains with presenting their evidence. Wasn't always amazing science, but it was always presented in a way which was coherent and understandable to the people present, who of course spanned various physiological disciplines. Not always what you find in seminars, I think, and it worked very well. So he was setting us a moral example in a way, although it didn't feel very comfortable at the time. I'm making him seem a little austere and a little threatening, perhaps. And that's maybe how these pictures seem. These pictures were taken on the occasion of his receiving the Nobel Prize, and that's why they're rather formal pictures. And you can recognize the suit, I think, as coming from that period in 1963. It lasted a long time. Andrew, and I'm going to correct that impression about Andrew because I want to emphasize how kindly he was, actually, and how he wasn't under the surface at all austere. But before I do that, I want to say something about his teaching. Andrew made a full contribution to the teaching program at all levels. He didn't have to do that, but it was his duty, and he did it. He was an excellent lecturer if he could assess the audience correctly. But he couldn't understand the intellect of the average first-year medical student. And so this was a problematic matter for the organisers of the first-year medical class. Andrew wanted to teach in it, but if he did, there were problems. One medical student said, "It would be easier to keep up if Professor Huxley did not immediately erase his equations with his left hand while writing away with his right." Here is a rather more affectionate reminiscence from another student who had Andrew as his first-year tutor. We all had tutorial groups, and so Andrew had a tutorial group which met weekly. This person, now a distinguished physician, says, "The initial impression was one of being in the presence of an intellect so far in advance of one's own as to be scarcely contactable. This was reinforced by the sombre surroundings of his office. His office is not sombre, actually, it has a large window and is quite light. All rather intimidating. My recollection is he would explain everything by way of mathematical equations. His lectures seemed mystifying at the time, but the notes I made in these introductory lectures served as the clear and comprehensive framework for my revision for the physiology degree exam 2.5 years later." He goes on like this. In his introductory lecture on the heart, Andrew Huxley repeated T.H. Huxley's joke for remembering which side the mitral valve is on. The joke is this: bishops are never in the right. He mentioned in passing that T.H. was his grandfather and thereby gave us the feeling of having a small part in a great tradition of science going back to the Victorians and beyond. The intellect was still way in advance of our own, but no longer so far out of reach. I like that. I think that shows something of what he contributed. Andrew liked to tackle problems logically, whether or not they were amenable to logical solution. I'll give you one example. There were not many stills in the department, and many people needed distilled water. Nobody liked the job of running or cleaning out the stills, so there was often a distilled water drought. And this was exacerbated by certain people taking distilled water to top up their car batteries, which was the practice at the time. Jim Pascoe, our common man, complains to Andrew about this and says, "We don't have enough stills, we need to buy some more." Next morning, he finds Andrew in his laboratory, stopwatch in hand, timing and measuring the flow from the still. After a short calculation, it's announced that there is enough water for all. No purchases would be made. Next morning, on the door of Jim's lab, it said, "James Pascoe, purveyor of fine waters to the gentry." Shortly after that, more stills appeared. These impressions are superficial and quite fun and show something of the affectionate dialogues that were there. But I haven't mentioned the true impact that Andrew made on the department, and that was as a tutor and mentor to his colleagues and to the many postgraduate students. In these one-on-one encounters, he really showed what he could do as a leader of the department. He took an interest in all of the research in the department, not in any intrusive way. He didn't interfere in anyone's research. If one chose not to discuss your research with Andrew, he wouldn't interfere with it. But if you asked for help, you would receive help, and you would receive help probably beyond your expectations. People have let me know how astonished they are with the depths of Andrew's understanding of their research on topics they thought far from his own. His interactions would be supportive. Often they were transformative. He would make calculations. Often on that train back from Cambridge, he would be calculating something for somebody. He thought up new analyses. He devised new methods. He adjusted the equipment, of course, especially if it contained some optical components, which were susceptible of being rearranged more favorably. He helped revise papers. He helped write papers. In all of these encounters, he could slow his thought processes down to match his colleague. Bob Simmons has referred to Andrew as having an extra gear mentally, and that is often what it felt like. But he would switch this off and engage you at the level you could comprehend. Thus, he would educate you. Now, what everybody remembers is his generosity with his time, but also his generosity in engagement with you. It's often referred to as kindness, and kindness could mean many things. There's kindness as courtesy. Andrew had what is perhaps now called an old-fashioned gentlemanly courtesy, which went with the territory, really. It's the way you would expect a senior scientist to behave, with gentlemanly courtesy. But much beyond that, he was prepared to be kind to you in trying to understand what you needed by way of learning. And I want to remind you what Vincenzo Lombardi referred to when he was speaking at Andrew's 90th birthday celebration a few years ago. He called it the moral value of explaining ideas in a way they can truly be shared by whoever you're explaining them to. In other words, your responsibility to educate the other party, to lead them on. Are we surprised to find this moral value in Andrew? Apparently we are, because many people are expressing that to me in their reminiscences. Thank you, everyone who sent me those reminiscences. We can learn many things from Andrew, and perhaps we haven't learned all the things we could have learned from him. Some of the things we might have learned from him are respect for our data, respect for those who went before, that is, reading the literature of years ago, whether it's online or not, for respect for work published in languages we might not speak, and also this respect for true education, the moral value of education. Perhaps we have more to learn because this virtue of education is not as common as it might be. Well, that's enough of the sermon. I'm going to give the last moments of my presentation to two Russian scientists. Here they are. Well, I won't show you their picture for a moment. Let me first tell you their story, the start of their story, which will finish in their own words. In 1989, Huxley visited Moscow at the invitation of the Academy of Sciences. He was giving a lecture there, and before the lecture, he met with these two gentlemen who were engaged in the study of muscle. He was interested by their results, that in turn had been inspired by his work. They gave him reprints of their articles in Russian as a courtesy, little knowing that Andrew could read Russian, and Andrew invited them to come to his hotel the following morning. To their surprise, the reprints were on the table, covered with notes. It turned out he was able to read a bit of what they had written. And then they say, we talked for an hour, and I'm sorry I missed that slide, but it should have been there. But you have it outside, so you can study that later. We talked for an hour and went out from the hotel shocked. Imagine a former president of the Academy of Sciences during an official trip meeting two young people doing some experiments on homemade equipment. Well, imagine that. Well, of course, Andrew would be fascinated by that. But it surprised these guys. Instead of perusing the sights of the capital, staying at the hotel to discuss their findings, it cannot be translated into Russian. It ought to be translated into every language. In short, Andrew provided for 22 years the intellectual backbone of the department and is remembered for that with affection and with gratitude. He also did some decent science during that time, and we're going to hear about that. Thank you very much.
So, my name is Jonathan Ashmore. I'm currently president of the Physiological Society, and I come from a generation later than the one that Roger was talking about. So my encounters with Andrew Huxley was really when he had already stopped being head of department, but was then a Royal Society research professorship, had a Royal Society research professorship. And this was a very typical sort of pose, which you will now recognise as being within the laboratory at UCL. And this, in fact, is one of Martin Rosenberg's wonderful pictures that archive the history of the Physiological Society. So the Society has had enormous influence on biomedical science, and both in the UK and also around the world. It's been instrumental in forming the careers of many of us, and there's also actually an intimate connection between the Society and the Royal Society. So many of the presidents of the Royal Society since the 1880s, when the Society was formed, have actually been members of the Society. In fact, our current president, Paul Nurse, is in fact a member of the Physiological Society. So my brief is to highlight just some of the interactions between Andrew Huxley and the Society. So Andrew Huxley published in the Society's journal, the Journal of Physiology. In fact, he contributed, some of his major work was actually published in that journal. So he was his Nobel Prize-winning work with Alan Hodgkin was in fact published in the Journal of Physiology exactly 60 years ago, this year, and he can continue to publish in the journal throughout his long, productive career. Andrew was elected a member of the Society in 1942, which means he was a member of the Society for 70 years. And I haven't actually been able to look up all the records of all the members, but I suspect that actually is a record for longevity of a member of the Society during its existence. He became a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Physiology in 1950. More about that in a moment. A position which he held for 7 years. And then he had two phases as essentially on the committee of the Physiological Society from 1957 until 1961. And then again, when he stepped down from being Jodrell Professor at UCL, the work is found for idle hands, as it were, from between 1970 and 1974. So the Committee of the Physiological Society is essentially the driving committee of the Society, which makes the decisions about how the society operates and the way in which it interacts with the journal. So, first of all, a little bit about the Physiological Society itself. The Society was established in 1876, initially as a dining club, but it started off with a dinner in John Burden Sanderson's house in Queen Anne Street in London, WC1. And here's the letter from John Burden Sanderson to Schaefer saying, please come to the dinner where we're proposing to start a physiological society. The society was really developed partly in response to a growing public anti-vivisection movement at that particular time, and partly in response to the need to form a focus for a growing number of scientists who were actually concerned with physiological mechanisms within living animals. So this letter shows the invitation, and he says that Sharpie Huxley, not Andrew F. Huxley, of course, but the grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, Foster, Michael Foster, who we've heard already about a little bit in connection with the Trinity connection, Lewis and others have been invited to attend, and I should be glad if you come also. So what happened at this particular meeting on the 31st of March? They decided it was a good idea to set up a society, and the people there were Sharpie, Thomas Henry Huxley, Michael Foster, who was at that time had moved from UC, University College London, up to Cambridge to become first Prilector and then subsequently to become the first Professor of Physiology at Cambridge. Here's Foster here, and here's Sanderson at the top here. Along with George Lewis, who was the partner of Mary Ann Evans, otherwise known as George Eliot, Francis Galton, and as you will see, a large cluster of Fellows of the Royal Society. So it was a very influential grouping of people, all 19 of them. Sanderson himself remained essentially at University College for the next few years before eventually moving up to Oxford to take up the first chair of physiology in Oxford and the Waynflete chair in the later part of the 1880s. So at that time, as a result of this meeting, the Society drew up a draft constitution on the 26th of April, 1876, which very much set the tone of the Society. And the Society, in fact, was designed so that it could start promptly with a dinner at 6 p.m, and then business would begin at 7 p.m, with the strict instruction that the business matters were to be finished in time so that the last train to Cambridge could be caught. So let's now move the clock a little bit further forward to 1942, which is when Andrew Huxley was then elected to the Physiological Society. Despite the Second World War, the committee still met in a rather formal sort of way. So this was a meeting of the committee at the National Institute of Medical Research, then run by Henry Dale up in Hampstead, NW3, on 1942. And there were various members in the chair in the committee, including A.V. Hill and George Lindor Brown, who we heard about already. And at that particular meeting, Andrew Huxley was proposed for membership of the Society. So there was very much a formal procedure of proposal. Dare one also say it being blackballed sometime, but you had to be recommended by the committee before you were eventually elected. So it was sort of modelled on the kind of royal, dare I say it, on a Royal Society sort of procedure. So as a result of that, Andrew Huxley became a member in 1942. At that time, the Society didn't in fact have all that many members, well under 500, possibly because the numbers were actually restricted. But the numbers began to creep up subsequently, and by 1957 the numbers had exceeded 700, and the numbers continued to rise rapidly through the 60s, 70s, until the numbers now being members of the Physiological Society amount to about 3,000. So this is the pattern of ordinary membership, essentially just between the period which we're concerned with at the beginning of Andrew Huxley's career as a member of the Physiological Society. Now, although he was an active scientist, he's obviously, as a member of the Physiological Society, he became involved in various committees and responsibilities of the Society. So in particular, as I mentioned, he was invited to join the editorial board, which is the board which runs essentially the Journal of Physiology and makes the decisions about how the journal is to be conducted. So he was elected in 1950, and the task then for an editor of the Journal of Physiology was essentially to review papers. So individual editors took on papers, reviewed them, and if two editors agreed that the paper should be accepted, then the paper was then sent for publication. So that was the nominal task of the editorial board, but there were other additional tasks which had to be undertaken as well. And so, for example, he rapidly became the press editor of the board in 1950 because the previous press editor, it seemed, had some problems. It was learnt, I'm sorry if this is rather not too legible, but you probably can't read at the back, but the front you may be able to. The board learnt of the ill health of Mr. Tunnicliffe, the press editor, and with great regret accepted to receive his resignation. It is believed that the burden which the journal has imposed on Mr. Tunnicliffe must be held in part responsible for the deterioration of his health. And coupled with its expression of gratitude to him is the hope that his indisposition will be of no long duration. It was agreed that the office of duty press editor should be taken over by the assistant press editor, Mr. A.F. Huxley. So the job then was interceding between the editorial board and Cambridge University Press, which was then actually running the printing the journal. His first observation to the editorial board at the next meeting was Huxley reported that the press had run out of paper on which to print the journal. It was agreed, however, that the wrapper of volume 112, 1 and 2, be put back to the 30th of January, a well-known business trick to ensure that it appears that the journal is running according to its schedule. A trick I'm sure you know that Network Rail employs assiduously. So Huxley also reported, of course, that there had been a rather small number of manuscripts, possibly because of Mr. Tunnicliffe's indisposition. But rapidly, though, the production of papers for the journal proceeded in the way that we now recognise in the journal. So, however, as well as being an editor, of course, Huxley's scientific career was continuing apace. And the 5 great papers concerning the action of the nerve action potential, which we're just about to hear about, of course, were part of that exercise. And so you will see that although in 1952 204 papers were submitted, and in fact 125 were published in 1952, which was an acceptance rate amazingly of 60%, what you can see here in the accession book is here manuscript number 49 in 1942 was A.L. Hodgkin and A.F. Huxley from the Physiological Laboratory in Cambridge, a quantitative description of membrane current and its application to excitation in nerve, received the 10th of March 1952, and sent out to 2 referees, Eggleton and Katz, and they returned their comments actually within a matter of 4 weeks. In fact, Eggleton returned the comments within 4 weeks. Katz may, as conventionally has always been the case, returned his comments so fast that the return time may even have been the same day. So that is Huxley's period of on the editorial board, and his spell as an editor came to an end in 1957. But he was considered too valuable to lose, so that he became a member of the committee for the next 4 years. And reading the committee minutes of the committee during that period, it's actually surprising how many items seem to be recurrent themes of the society. The committee then, as now, was discussing the travel budgets for Congress, the costs of premises, income fluctuations for the journals, and so on and so on. The only one episode which seems to have gone away as a society responsibility is the proposal to develop a breeding centre for experimental animals. In fact, to develop a cattery to cope with the demand of the 10,000 cats per annum that were used for physiological research in 1960. So that was a discussion that went on for the best part of 10 years, and Huxley was intimately involved in the in the negotiations over whether or not a cattery should be built. In fact, the answer was no in the end. When he stepped down from the Jodrell chair at UCL in 1969 to take up the Royal Society Research Professorship, Huxley was then invited onto the committee. At the last committee meeting that he was involved in 1961, he in fact was hosting the committee meeting at Trinity College, Cambridge, in the old guest room. And the committee meetings record that Huxley had kindly arranged for a sherry and dinner party at Trinity College, and he was suitably thanked for all the admirable arrangements for the meeting and subsequent entertainment. History doesn't relate what the subsequent entertainment was, but the thanks are acknowledged, not all the same. The previous item is sort of interesting. It's the item 22 of those committee meetings. It says that a letter from the Medical Research Council offering some accommodation to the Society at their new present premises in Regent's Park at a cost of 21 shillings per square foot was read. It was agreed that the committee did not wish to take advantage of this offer. So it sounded like an absolute bargain, but it wasn't actually ever taken up. And you will be glad to hear that eventually, if I can do the sum in my head, 40 years after that event, the Physiological Society has eventually got its own premises, which we hope will be opened in the beginning of 2013. But it's taken 40 years of committee meetings of the Physiological Society to progress from item 22 on the 4th of November 1961. So he took up the research professorship and remained on the committee between 1970 and 1974. And I think what is particular, I won't say any more about that because I'm sure that that period may well overlap with the memories of many people actually here in this room. But it was noticeable even during that period that he was dealt very tactfully and effectively with many of the issues that came up at committee discussions, in particular the aftermath of the Prague Spring, where many meetings that were designed to be held in Eastern Europe had got derailed, and the Physiological Society had to deal with the problem as a result. Huxley gave an annual review lecture in 1974, was elected to an honorary membership, and this picture, and I think also the microscope you can see in the exhibition outside, but this was the face of Andrew Huxley that looked out as the experimentalist we knew up in his little room up the laboratory up in University College London, and delivered this wonderful annual lecture which essentially provided all the information that those of us not in the field wanted to know about muscle. So this includes a description of much of the work that he and Bob Simmons undertook. So Huxley published 41 full-length papers in the Journal of Physiology, not to mention numerous demonstrations and communications. There were also publications in many other journals, including, as from my point of view, a key paper on how the cochlea works, that was published in Nature in 1969. And those of us in the hearing neurophysiology field feel to some extent thankful that he did not resolve all the problems in hearing, and luckily moved into muscle instead. So I want to end just with a little coda, and this is a story which, the pointer to this, I owe my thanks to Anne Silver and Carol Huxley, and it's the following one, which is that in 1970, Nature published a short correspondence which is described as the effects of sexual activity on beard growth in man. The author was never revealed. It was a certain author called Anon, for obvious reasons. And this was a certain gentleman who reported that for the past 2 years, he'd spent considerable periods on a remote island in comparative isolation. And he noticed that his beard growth diminished, but the day before he was due to leave, it increased again. And he came to the conclusion that the beard growth was related to the resumption of sexual activity, or at least the anticipation of it. So here is the period of isolation, and here is essentially the beard collected by his filly shaver, weighed dutifully and plotted out as a function of the period which he was staying on the island. Here's his period of isolation. The beard growth drops, and there, with the little indication, the female symbol here, is something happening, indicating that the beard growth is growing. Well, this is obviously, you can imagine this was like a red rag to Andrew Huxley, and 3 weeks later, a correspondence surfaced in Nature from Andrew, saying that your anonymous correspondent claims to have shown the association between sexual activity and the growth of facial hair. However, he makes no reference to a paper by Verel. Verel, having published in the Journal of Physiology in 1955, presumably a paper actually which Andrew may well have been the referee for. And the gist of this paper was that when you sit up, water redistributes itself from your facial skin, and so the skin around the hair follicle thins a little bit, and so the razor can go deeper in, and you actually end up with more beard in the razor. And so if you actually shave after breakfast, rather than before you get up, you will find that more beard is sitting in your razor. And so he says in this sort of incisive way, so thus, unless allowance has been made for it, in other words, the time of shaving, the phenomenon described by Verel might also account for the peak in hair growth between 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. reported by your correspondent. So once an editor, always an editor and a reviewer, but the response is also typically Andrew Huxley. The response is posed in a polite, incisive, and sort of damning way, so characteristic of Andrew Huxley. Thank you very much.
Well, the huge pleasure falls to me to attempt the impossible task of describing the work for which Andrew Huxley, together, of course, with Alan Hodgkin, and also shared with Jack Eccles, won the Nobel Prize, which was, of course, their phenomenal work published in the Journal of Physiology, as we've just learnt, in 1952. It's 44 pages long. I think there's about 300 equations, and of course it was an achievement which certainly the impact that it had on many other people in the physiological world is still, I think, being assessed today. As I will show a little bit later in these few remarks, the ideas of the Hodgkin-Huxley approach to characterizing the properties of membrane channels and how they can form various ways in which electrical activity can occur in excitable cells. That idea has spread way beyond the work that they did on nerve, through to the heart, which is my own area, through to the pancreas, and through to the lung and many other tissues. But I want, in pointing out this particular paper, to draw attention to something that has always struck me. I first read this as a third-year undergraduate at UCL, must have been 1957, so just 5 years after it was published, and I think I probably only understood a tiny fraction of it. But notice the title. Anybody else would have called this a theory of nerve excitation, or at least a model of nerve excitation. What is it? It is a quantitative description of membrane current and its application to conduction and excitation in nerve. What an understatement of the achievement of this paper. It was, of course, remarkable. Though it was, of course, a description. If you look at the way in which they characterized the rise of the potassium current in the potassium channels of the squid giant axon at various membrane potentials, you'll notice the accuracy with which the curves, which are their equations for the kinetics of the opening and closing of the channels, fits through to the experimental data, including the fact that there's a delay in the way in which the curves onset. The same was true, of course, of the way in which they characterized the sodium channels, though more complicated because there was a process not only of activation of the channel but also inactivation of the channel. And very many of the characteristics that they deduced, and remember in those days people would not have known either these were indeed protein channels or indeed the structure of them, many of the details of the equations that they fitted to their experimental results turn out to have beautiful correspondence in what we now know of the molecular biology of the channels. The problem, though, was having put together the differential equations for the various components of the system, various kinetics of opening and closing of channels, how could the equations be integrated? And Andrew worked, as I understand it, for about 6 months with a Brunswiga calculator. I knew this calculator because there was one in the physiology laboratory when I was working there, and also tried it out. I'll come on to the question of why it turned out to be impossible to do what Andrew did in nerve, in heart. But what you did, of course, was to dial a number and then dial another one and then crank the machine around like this, and another number would come out, and then you write it down, and then you do the whole thing again. Well, how long did it take to solve this equation? Well, to get about 5 milliseconds of activity, it took about 8 hours. No wonder, therefore, that there was 6 months of this. I was, as a young student at University College London, when I became a graduate student, I was asked, after Andrew had moved to UCL, to a dinner party given by Mel Schachter in North London, and Andrew was the other guest. And in those days, Mel had a table tennis table out in his conservatory, and so Andrew and I were pitched together with each other to play a game of table tennis. Well, you can guess who won. The movement of the arm had obviously strengthened his muscles enormously, but as we saw earlier on from the tennis match, he threw himself into everything he did. Why couldn't I do the same thing with the Brunswiga? Well, it's very simple. The cardiac action potential is about 100 times longer. If you calculate what you'd need to do if you were going to do the same kind of calculation of 500 millisecond, you'd be doing this for about 3 months. And of course, that's what led to the question, could one use electronic computers? And interestingly, Andrew was already doing that. This is about 1959, and he started work using the EDSAC computer in Cambridge, built by Maurice Wilkes. Maurice Wilkes is the gentleman bending down over here, fixing something up to do with the computer. These computers, of course, they were made of valves. They generated vastly more heat than light. Here he is, of course, this is Maurice Wilkes much later, but this is the machine on which Andrew did one of the calculations that influenced me enormously. It was to demonstrate the possibility of repetitive activity. This is from a paper that he published in 1959 in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. All he did with the Hodgkin-Huxley equations for the squid nerve was to change the calcium concentration surrounding the nerve axon to demonstrate that there was a range of calcium concentrations over which the equations would reproduce repetitive activity. Now, the significance of that for somebody like me, working at that time with Otto Hutter at University College London, working on the heart and interested in the question whether the Hodgkin-Huxley type equations could reproduce repetitive rhythm, the impact of that paper is very obvious. It was a huge encouragement to do what I then did with their equations, which was to take some results that Otto Hutter and I got on the potassium current in cardiac cells, showing a very different behavior from nerve. This is demonstrating that the potassium current actually switches off as you depolarize the heart muscle cell, and only later on does it then rise with another component coming in. So you first see a reduction in conductance and then a slow rise. And what I did, inspired by the Hodgkin-Huxley paper, which I'd read it as an undergraduate, was to proceed to put a model together with their sodium current equations, with those two potassium channels put in, and for good measure there was a chloride channel. And I didn't have an EDSAC, but there was the Ferranti Mercury computer at UCL on which you punched holes in paper tape corresponding to the various codes that you would write. Here's a photograph of the kind of paper tape that you used to feed into those machines, and this was the result obtained in 1960 with the first attempt at reconstructing rhythmic activity in the heart. There are now, I think, about 200 cardiac cell models. There are many pancreatic cell models. There are many models of other excitable cells. The inheritance, if I can put it that way, of the ideas that Hodgkin and Huxley pioneered has clearly been enormous in fields way outside their own. Now I come just to two final stories to finish what I'm going to say. That work, inspired by them, was published in 1960 in Nature. Andrew Huxley, incidentally, didn't move to University College London until 1961, so I wasn't at that time interacting with him. But I did interact with him when he moved to UCL, because in 1961, a very ingenious experiment had been performed by some workers in Australia. They plunged double-barrel electrode into cardiac tissue and proceeded to determine whether there was or was not nonlinearity in the response to the applied current. And to everyone's surprise, certainly to mine, they found that the responses were entirely linear. Now, that is completely incompatible with a Hodgkin-Huxley approach to excitation in excitable cells. The nonlinearity is an essential feature of what they did. So it was not only a challenge to the application of the Hodgkin-Huxley equations to other tissues, but also implicitly a challenge to any form of analysis of electric excitation in that form. I was at the time attending some mathematics lectures at University College London. I wasn't trained as a mathematician, so I had to rapidly go up the learning curve. And I had learnt enough to realize that what you needed for a situation like this was a Bessel form of partial differential equations. And so I went off to the Mercury computer, programmed it up, and put in the appropriate Bessel functions, and got a result that totally surprised me. Instead of a nice monotonic decay of electric potential, what I found was oscillation. So I went in desperation to Andrew. He was in that office that Roger Woolwich described earlier on. And I showed him this result. And he stared at me with that headmasterly style. He said, "Dennis, you need a Bessel function of an imaginary argument." And I looked at him. A what? And imagine, this was my first introduction to the square root of -1, of course, so I had to go back to the maths lectures, work out what was going on. But he was absolutely right. I'd got the wrong Bessel function, and when you put in the right one, you got the nice monotonic decay. And the good side of this story, as it was possible to explain the result of those experiments plunging 2 electrodes into the cardiac tissue. I come to one final remark, which is not scientific at all. Ron Whittam, a fellow of the Royal Society and an emeritus professor at Leicester University, wrote to me just a few days ago. And you said, would you kindly mention this at the meeting at the Royal Society? It is Ron Whittam's explanation for the second part of Andrew's name, because, of course, it starts as Andrew and then Fielding Huxley. I can't guarantee this, and I'd love to be able to talk to people over wine later on to check whether this is correct, but Ron Whittam's explanation is that it comes from the fact that Andrew's great-grandfather was Fielding Johnson, who was the great philanthropist of Leicester University. Indeed, this is the Fielding Johnson building, and as I said, I'd love to know whether this is correct. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to describe Andrew Huxley's research on muscle. Andrew turned to muscle research very early in 1951, immediately after completing the papers with Hodgkin on the nerve impulse in the squid giant axon that we've just heard about. And he explained his reasons for the switch in this autobiographical article written in 1977. He says he felt that it was time to move into another branch of physiology. He got interested in muscle because he'd taken on the undergraduate muscle lectures at Cambridge. And he had discovered in preparing those lectures that there was a lot of confusion in the muscle field about the fact that muscle fibers from skeletal muscle and the heart have these stripes or striations. He thought that by switching to work on muscle, he might get some fresh insight into the process of muscle contraction by understanding how these stripes behaved. And by the way, at the same time, it would give him an excuse to indulge in his hobby and build an interference microscope. So the idea that the behavior of the stripes in muscle might help us to understand how this works seems like a fairly obvious idea to us now in retrospect. But in 1951, it wasn't considered an obvious idea. It was actually considered to be a distraction for those interested in fundamental mechanisms. Biochemistry was very much to the fore and had been in the previous couple of decades. And a common argument of the time was that, well, since smooth muscle doesn't have any stripes and contracts perfectly well, then contraction can't really be fundamentally to do with the stripes. We must look for contraction, the understanding of the process of contraction at the molecular level, and we'll never see the molecules in the light microscope. So why bother with this, which is probably an artifact anyway? There was a lot of confusing literature at the time about why these stripes were there. There was talk about fixation artifacts and optical artifacts. So Andrew decided to tackle this problem and use this image to try and understand how muscle worked. And he decided to do that by working on intact muscle cells, so there was no question about fixation. And he decided to tackle the optical problems by designing and building an interference microscope, because with an interference microscope, you could image these dark bands called the A bands, which have much higher, you could use that as a mechanism of contrast to image the dark bands, which have a much higher refractive index than the intermediate I bands, the light bands, which have a lower refractive index. And an interference microscope is a way to do this on a thick specimen like a muscle fiber without getting any optical artifacts. So Andrew, therefore, as you would, designed and built an interference microscope to a principle which at the time he believed to be novel. It turned out there's an old literature on this, which he wrote about much later on. But this is his first low-power interference microscope, and it's the same one as in the portrait, and it's on demonstration outside, so you can have a look at it afterwards. The difference from an ordinary microscope, fundamentally, is that here, underneath the stage, the illuminating beam is split into two beams. One of them goes through the muscle fiber, which would be sitting on the stage here, and the other one goes past it. And then the two beams are recombined after being collected by the objective in another prism here, which exactly superimposes them so that you can measure the phase difference between the two beams, and that gives you your interference image. So it sounds really easy. Actually, it's a very demanding piece of optical engineering, especially at the high resolution that you need to image the striations in muscle, which are about 2 microns across. So it actually took several years to build first this low-power interference microscope and then a high-power version. But the culmination of that work was that Andrew, working with Rolf Niedergerke in this paper, published in 1954, published one of the fundamental papers that led to the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. And the fundamental observation is shown here. The little numbers on the left are the sarcomere lengths. So the top is stretched fibers, and in stretched fibers, you can see that the A band is the same length as in unstretched fibers, but the I band, the light band, is bigger. And this, he also showed, took place when muscle fibers contracted in response to electrical stimulation. So both when passively stretched and when activated, the A band stayed the same length. And around the same time, Hugh Huxley and Gene Hansen, working with single myofibrils and a different kind of microscope, came to the same conclusion. In fact, they published their paper back-to-back in Nature with Andrew and Rolf Niedergerke's paper. And later on, this is the basic idea of the sliding filament theory. Very soon afterwards, it became clear that the A bands are where the myosin protein is in the sarcomere, and the actin is in the I bands and the overlap region. So you have two overlapping sets of filaments. When the sarcomere shortens, which is going from the top to the bottom picture, the filaments stay the same length, but the degree of interdigitation changes, and that's why the sarcomere length changes. So that was in 1954. Andrew next turned his attention to the mechanism of muscle activation. Now, at this time, the key question about how muscle was activated was, how does this kind of muscle, which is a fast twitch muscle, get activated so fast? It was known that the action potential, just like the nerve action potential, went all the way along the muscle fiber, along the surface of the muscle fiber. But the question was, how did it get into the middle of the muscle fiber so quickly when this cell could have a radius of about 100 microns? It was pretty easy to show, and A.V. Hill, who's been mentioned earlier, made this argument first, that you couldn't have a diffusible signaling molecule, even a small molecule, getting into the middle of the fiber fast enough. So there had to be something else going on. So Andrew attacked this problem again using the interference microscope with Bob Taylor. And what he did in this experiment was to locally activate by putting this small pipette with a diameter of about a micron against the surface of the muscle fiber. And he showed that if you put the pipette against an A band, which is the dark band, and then applied a small electrical current, then in the top picture, when you apply a small electrical current to the A band, nothing happens. But in the bottom row, when you apply a small electrical current, a depolarizing current to the I band, just that one I band shortens. So this showed that this special signaling mechanism was in the middle of the I band. And to investigate that structure further, Andrew actually turned to electron microscopy, and with his characteristic approach of first improving the technology before doing the experiment, developed a new microtome for cutting thin sections of fixed embedded muscle fibers, and that microtome is also on display outside. But I won't say much more about that story except to say, in summary, the end of the story. This is a picture by Lee Peachy, one of Andrew's collaborators on the activation mechanism. And it shows what later EM, electron microscope pictures by Andrew and colleagues and by other people independently showed, which was a special membrane system called the transverse tubular system, which goes into the muscle fiber in the middle of the eye band, and the action potential goes down these tubules, and that's how the muscle fibers get activated so fast. So other people in Andrew's lab went on with that problem, but Andrew himself went back to the mechanism of contraction itself and asked the question, well, if muscle contracts by the sliding of these filaments, what makes the filaments slide? He was already thinking about this in detail in 1954 and 1955. And in 1957, he published his first theory of how muscle works. And in this theory, there are cross bridges between the myosin filaments, which are the pink ones here, and the actin filaments, shown in a rather more modern representation in grey. And Andrew made some pretty simple postulates which were revolutionary and kind of mind-boggling at the time that he made them, which was these cross bridges between myosin and actin filaments are elastic. That's represented by this little spring here. And thermal energy stretches the spring at random, so these cross bridges, before they attach to actin, are jiggling around. But we'll put in a postulate that when they're jiggling around in a positive direction, so that the spring is stretched, they're more likely to attach. And when they're jiggling around in a negative direction, they're less likely to attach. So this is called a thermal ratchet. And with just a few simple assumptions about how the attachment and detachment rate constants for this myosin cross bridge depended on the strain X, he actually was able to reproduce the main mechanical and energetic properties of muscle that were known at the time. And I won't show you all the equations, but it was quite a remarkable degree of fit. These concepts that he introduced, the idea of cyclical attachment and detachment of cross bridges, the idea that molecular motors are intrinsically elastic, the idea of strain-dependent rate constants, are still in all our modern theories of muscle contraction, and not just of muscle contraction, but of all kinds of other molecular motors that drive essential processes in cell division, like cell division. But in 1957, this model, although intrinsically appealing, one has to say was highly speculative. And Andrew took on the challenge then, which over really the next 30 years, of testing this model. And he went back again to the sliding filament mechanism and said, well, okay, according to this idea, according to the 1957 theory, there are lots of myosin cross bridges along the overlap zone. So if you think that theory is right, the first thing you ought to test is that the force that a muscle fiber makes should be proportional to the degree of overlap between the myosin motors in the myosin filaments and the actin filament. And if you go to a shorter sarcomere length, there'll be more overlap, so you should get more force. That sounds like really quite an easy thing to test. Actually, it's not quite as easy as it sounds, because muscle fibers don't have the same length of sarcomere all along the fiber, and the length of the sarcomeres doesn't stay the same when you activate the muscle fiber. So again, Andrew engaged in a considerable period, a long period of technical development, and this slide in a very simple way shows the feedback technique that he developed called the spot follower, or the sarcomere length clamp, working with Fred Julian and Al Gordon in the 1960s. And conceptually, this sarcomere length clamp is the same as the voltage clamp in the squid axon. So in the squid axon, you clamp the voltage and watch what the current does. What he wanted to do in a muscle fiber was clamp the length and watch what the force does. And this is the first version of that, which is the simplest version, which is he put two gold foil markers on a bit of the muscle fiber so that the sarcomeres were uniform in between. He had a very fancy optoelectronic system that I won't describe that gave a continuous readout of the position of those markers, and he fed that back to a motor in a feedback loop to hold the distance between these two markers constant. Then you really knew what sarcomere length you were working with, and you could measure the force. And I'll just show you the famous, well-known result of this, also published in the Journal of Physiology in 1966. And I'll just point out the simple part of this, which is the region of sarcomere length between 2.25, which is what you have in this cartoon. All the myosin cross bridges overlap with actin. You get the maximum force. This is the force plotted on the y-axis here in the top. And at sarcomere length 3.65 is where you've just pulled out the myosin filaments, so they no longer overlap with the actin, and you get no force. So these results were consistent with his model and more generally with the idea of independent force generators in the region of overlap between the filaments. But he wasn't satisfied with that, of course. He then extended the sarcomere length concept to do the exact analogy to the squid axon voltage clamp experiment. So take the feedback loop, introduce a command signal where we'll put a rapid step in the length of the muscle fiber. Therefore, we'll make this local region, we'll make each sarcomere shortened by a few nanometers, and we'll measure the force. And from the the transient force response that we can get if we make this step fast enough, we'll see the intrinsic mechanism of muscle contraction. So again, this was a technical challenge, and it took many years to solve this technical challenge to his satisfaction. In order to do that, he had to make a faster electric motor because there weren't any motors available which would move the end of a muscle fiber fast enough. So he designed a new motor, moving coil type of motor, which could, by attaching the muscle fiber to the end of this very light lever arm, initially I think made from grass stems from the banks of the River Cam, you'd attach the muscle fiber here, and this motor could produce length steps of about 1%, so a few nanometers in each sarcomere in 200 microseconds. And this was work done with Lincoln Ford and Bob Simmons in the 1970s. The other thing he had to do was to make a fast force transducer that would work on the same time scale. So to do that, again with the same co-workers, he attached aluminium clips to the tendon on the end of a muscle fiber. The aluminium clip then was attached to a very light hook, and the hook was one plate of a capacitor, which was working in a tuned circuit so that you could measure the very small force produced by a single muscle cell, and the moving parts were very light and stiff, so you could get 200 microseconds resolution on the force transducer too. So another sort of tour de force of technological innovation. And putting all these things together led to the paper published with Bob Simmons in 1971 called The Proposed Mechanism of Force Generation in Striated Muscle. And the key point of this is that by putting on a very fast length step, the length step is shown at the top, what he could do was to resolve this fast force recovery called phase 2, which has a rate of about 1,000 per second. And he found that phase 2 process only worked over a range of a few nanometers and saturated about 10 nanometers. And this phase 2 turns out to be the elementary force-generating process in a myosin molecule. And this he introduced, of course, he made a quantitative model of this, which I won't show you in detail, but the fundamental modification to his earlier 1957 model, which is shown on the left, you still have the springs, you still have the cross bridges between the myosin filaments in pink and the actin filaments in grey, but now the myosin cross bridge, or myosin head domain as it's known in more modern terms, changes shape while it's bound to actin. This is called the working stroke in the attached myosin head domain, and this is what he and Bob Simmons showed in their 1971 experiments. And Andrew continued to develop the technology. He wasn't satisfied with this performance, and in the 1980s he developed this instrument called a striation follower, which took measurements, so it did away with the markers. He used a fancy optical imaging method to image the striations or the stripes directly with a time resolution of a few microseconds. There's a version of this striation follower outside to have a look at later, and for the brave, I'm sure that somebody will volunteer to explain how this device works. It's very complicated. Here's Andrew's drawing of how it was going to be put together with the mechanical apparatus. And this striation follower, Andrew's striation follower, actually is still in use today. This actually is Andrew Huxley's striation follower, the one that came from his lab. When he retired in the 1990s, he gave it to Vincenzo Lombardi and Gabriella Piazzesi, and they, with their colleagues, modified it and, as you can see, turned it round through 90 degrees, because this one is mounted at an X-ray synchrotron in Chicago. And you have to have the muscle fibers vertical for this X-ray experiment, so the striation follower had to turn around. So Andrew's striation follower is still in use. There's still no better way of measuring the behavior of striations in a living muscle fiber. So I'm going to finish on that. I've only got one more slide. I've concentrated on the things that Andrew Huxley, the major contributions that Andrew Huxley made to our understanding of muscle. He really was a giant in the field, and you can see from the few things that I've really only scratched the surface of what he did, but I think I wanted to give you a flavour of the biological significance of what he did, and also the technical challenge of what he did. And Stuart's going to say a little bit more about that, his work as his engineering contribution in the next talk. In concentrating on these few things, I'm conscious that I've missed out all his other wonderful personal qualities. Fortunately, other people earlier have mentioned those already. The one that I want to finish with was how wonderful Andrew Huxley was as an inspiration and as a mentor to many people who were new to the muscle field, like me. And I noticed that there are many other people here today who I think would share me would join me in that view of being grateful for the wonderful contribution that Andrew made to their careers. So on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am Stuart Huxley, Andrew's son, and I'm going to say a few words about my father as an engineer. When being introduced by my father to his colleagues, he would often recall how engineering ran in the family. He would quote his grandfather, T.H., who wrote in a short autobiography, "As I grew older, my great desire was to be a mechanical engineer, but the fates were against this. And while very young, I commenced study of medicine under a medical brother-in-law. The only part of my professional course which really and deeply interested me was physiology, which is the mechanical engineering of living machines." And Andrew was to write, "My interest in physiology is exactly described by the phrase, the mechanical engineering of living machines, and a substantial part of my work has been the design and construction of instruments needed for my research," as we have just been told by Malcolm so well. As I will tell, he encouraged my interest in engineering, and I have made a career as a hands-on design engineer in Huxley Bertram Engineering, the company that William Bertram and I have run for 30-plus years. My son Lawrence is also an engineer, and he works with us, playing a central part in the mechanical and computer aspects of our work. And we have high hopes for his son Jasper, based on his interest in the train set he was given on his second birthday last week. Just a word about how Andrew got into physiology, and that because his childhood interests were mechanical, and as we've heard from John Bradfield, he came up to Cambridge in 1935 to read natural sciences, expecting to specialise in physics with a view to becoming an engineer. But he had, as part of the course, to choose a third science, and he was advised to choose physiology by Ben Delisle Burns, a friend from Hampstead, who was then in his third year at King's, on the grounds that even in his first year he would be learning things that were still controversial, unlike physics and chemistry, which were cut and dried. He quickly became interested in physiology through supervisions from William Rushton and Jack Roughton, and from meeting other members of the college with similar interests, including David Hill and Alan Hodgkin, as we have heard. And then in his fourth year, in the year 1938-39 that he was invited by Alan Hodgkin to work with him on the giant squid axon, and thus started his career in physiological research. And throughout his research years, engineering was a key part of his work, and I think we've had great evidence of that. And Andrew's interest in engineering continued throughout in his later life, and when, as an ex officio fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineers, he would invite me to lecture evenings in London, maybe once or twice a year. With the help of Bob Simmons and others, there is outside a collection of instruments and other items associated with Andrew, which illustrate the origins and the width of his engineering skills. The rest of this talk is a quick run through these items with the subtitles, A History of Andrew in 10 Objects. The first object is this Swift microscope. From an early age, Andrew showed an interest in the world around him, with a special leaning to mechanical things. He was encouraged in this by his family, and the first object is the Swift microscope given to him when he was around 12 years old. This is a good instrument, giving a magnification up to 200 times, and it was engraved with his name, which would have made it that much more special. This not only gave Andrew a window into the world of small things, but it was something to take to pieces and discover how it worked. His half-brother Julian Huxley gave him the book The Microscope, a Practical Handbook by L.H. Drew and L. Wright, and so started a lifelong interest in optics and microscopy. A few years later, he chose as a school prize Applications of Interferometry by W. Ewart Williams, which, as we have heard, came in very handy for his muscle research. In the family home in London, where he was brought up, Andrew and his brother David played with the usual wooden blocks, train sets and Meccano. Andrew's mechanical bent was evident, as he was soon making additions and improvements to these toys. In his craftsmanship, he was encouraged by his mother Rosalind, who was a practical person and very good with her hands, and she would have been very much behind this second object, a Drummond 4-inch metal turning lathe that was given to the brothers when Andrew was 15. He taught himself to use it, and it was soon making improvements to it, such as additional scales and a drive for the cross-slide. And later, Andrew made much of the equipment for his research on it, and it was still set up in the garage at Grantchester until I moved it last weekend. After Andrew moved to UCL in 1960, the lathe was installed in the attic of the family home in Grantchester, and he taught me, at age 11 or 12, how to use it. It had its original treadle drive, so that I couldn't do serious damage to myself or to it. When I was reasonably proficient, he helped me make a 6cc petrol engine from a set of castings, and it ran very successfully. His patient instruction and encouragement set me on the path to engineering. These candlesticks are an example of the craftsmanship encouraged by Andrew's mother. The stems were turned on the lathe, and the bases were hand-carved, though on one, the detail was never completed. You can see it outside. You can't, it's a bit round the back there on that one. They have been on the mantelpiece at home as long as I can remember. And these are a collection of geometric solids that Andrew made, probably when a schoolboy. It is said that later, in quiet moments during the war, he made pairs of sketches of the models from slightly different angles, so that when viewed simultaneously from the right distance, they would appear as three-dimensional objects. This was just to keep his mind in trim when he didn't have anything else to think about. Object 5 is the giant squid axon, which was central to the nerve work carried out with Alan Hodgkin. We didn't try and get one here today, but somehow it should be part of the collection. Andrew's ingenuity was needed here. His engineering ingenuity was needed here in a set of mirrors used to view the microelectrode from two directions simultaneously in order to steer it down the centre of the axon. We have heard from Dennis Noble completely how this instrument was part of Andrew's work on the nerve and sorting out the solutions to the equations. And I won't describe it because he'd done it so well. I will just say that outside, for the last round of calculations that Andrew was doing, he had hoped to use the EDSAC computer, but it was being upgraded at the time, so he had to finish off using the hand calculator. But he was interested in it, and indeed we have found in his papers the manual, Introduction to Programming for the EDSAC. So if you want to go and find out how to do it, it's out there. It is interesting to note that during the war, his 5 years of operational research in anti-aircraft and naval gunnery had given him useful experience in the numerical solution of equations and the theory of servo mechanisms, both of which were relevant to different parts of his research work. This we also have seen in Malcolm's talk, and is the interference microscope. And as we do seem to have heard, that every time Andrew moved on to a slightly new subject, he redesigned all the equipment and made it work better and so on. And indeed, he needed an interference microscope for the better view of the detailed structure of frog muscle fibres. And again, the idea and the ideas behind this came from his general interest in microscopy and that school prize book that he had chosen so many years before. And Andrew physically made the parts, and again you can see the brass parts here on above and underneath, and this wonderfully sort of crude-looking arm, but which does exactly the job is needed. And that was always his way, was a very economical type of design. Nothing was over fancy, and doing the very job that was required of it. And this microscope again is the one, as has been mentioned earlier, is in the portrait with Andrew. This object is a micromanipulator that, again, as Malcolm mentioned, in the work with Bob Taylor for trying to activate the muscle fibres at the particular parts of the striation, it was necessary to move that micropipette of 1 micron diameter against the relevant portion of the fibre. And this is the instrument which enabled that, and it's outside. It's a beautifully economical unit, and it relies on pivots with cross-strip hinges which avoid all backlash and lubrication problems. It's rather difficult to see in here, but rather than using rods in holes as pivots, they are just little flexural members, so they bend, but as I say, there's no sliding, there's no lubrication, and there's no free play. And the operator on this instrument turns the 3 large diameter thimbles, and so the weight of their hand, which are all attached to the base, and so the weight of the hand and those forces are taken directly into the base and don't affect the anything on the top stage where the delicate bits are mounted. These instruments were made for researchers in other disciplines by the engineering department at Cambridge University for a number of years, and then our company took over this work, and we continue to sell a small number of them. And the units on the display outside was kindly lent by Jonathan Ashmore. I think there's a sort of strong following among those who use them, who find them very nice indeed. And again, as we have heard from Malcolm, when moving into electron microscopy with his muscle work, Andrew first of all set about redesigning the microtome. And this has to be Object 9. And the design is based on a previous microtome by Porter and Blum in terms of the layout, but like the micromanipulator, it uses spring strip hinges to avoid backlash and lubrication. Another point is that the cutting stroke is driven by gravity. Just briefly, the sample is held on the end of that long bar, and this lever across here is used to lift it, and then it drops under gravity, and its speed controlled by a dashpot. And each time it's elegant also that as you lift the lever, the specimen is advanced, and here's a micrometer screw which is just turned a small amount, and then it operates through a lever arm of 250 to 1. And so you can get advances of the specimen of between 0.005 microns and up to 0.14 microns. So these are really fantastically thin things which are required for electron microscopy. And the blade, you might wonder what it is in something like this, but it's a piece of broken glass. You have to be careful about breaking it, and you can see it. It's inside that little blue chamber there. The blue chamber is to hold water, I think, or a liquid on which the slice that comes off floats, because it doesn't really stand up otherwise. The final object is indeed the striation follower system combined with the motor and the force transducers, as has been so well described by Malcolm. I won't go into all of it, I think, but it illustrates, I think, as Malcolm was saying, all the optics, and there's a laser beams in the latest version. Yes, understanding of optics, and there's mechanical. The time response of this motor is quite phenomenal. Again, spring strip hinges were used, and indeed, as Malcolm was saying, these were used as dried grass stems were used to make this structure. And when they were developing it, they would find odd resonances, and each time they found a new resonance, they would stick a few more struts in to cut out that particular one. But it does, overall, it illustrates the great range of skills that have gone into getting it all to work. And while many researchers have been involved, I think it would be fair to say that it was Andrew's deep knowledge of physics and mathematics, and coupled with his practical engineering skills, that have resulted in such a refined system. I seem to duplicate here, but here we see Andrew with the interference microscope he designed and built, which is an indication of how central he felt his engineering skills were to his life and work. It only remains for me, on behalf of the family, to thank Sir Paul Nurse and the Royal Society for so generously organising and hosting this event, and the staff for their ready help in getting things to run so smoothly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stuart, for that very nice ending, taking on Neil McGregor, I note. And I also want to thank all our speakers this evening who have captured so well the life and spirit of a great scientist and a great man. I would like now to invite you all for a reception in the rooms at the end of the hall there, through those doors. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.